Coming up, Lafayette gets back in battle. He takes a stand and declares who he's loyal to. And he finally takes off those rose-tinted spectacles. Welcome to Living Lafayette. From Lafayette Alliance in LaGrange, Georgia, I'm Richard Ingram. Just a reminder, here not far away, June 8th through the 11th, Thursday through Sunday, the American Friends of Lafayette are coming to LaGrange, Georgia. And there are events for the public to come and enjoy, and they're free of charge. So on Friday, June the 9th at 12:30, we will have a talk on Lafayette and abolition, and Professor Linda McMullen for Grange College will give that talk at Wesley Hall, First United Methodist Church. And then immediately following, this is something you don't want to miss, at Price Theater and LaGrange College, there will be a play. Lafayette will be there, Hamilton will be there, Napoleon will be there, and Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, amongst others in the cast, and the public's invited to come. And immediately after, over at Lamar Dodd Art Museum, there will be a Lafayette exhibit curated by Professor John Lawrence. So don't miss it. That's on Friday. And Saturday, get this. This is a big deal. Mayor Willie Edmondson has declared Saturday American Friends of Lafayette Day in LaGrange. So starting from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m., the Lafayette Trolley will loop around downtown, and parents and children, visitors are invited. The trolley will board every 30 minutes there on West Lafayette Square, right in front of the Marriott. And it'll just run a loop. It'll usually take about 20 or 30 minutes. So I invite you to come and enjoy a free ride on the Lafayette Trolley. And at 10 a.m., Lafayette himself will be on Lafayette Square from 10 till noon. And then from noon to 2, Lafayette's wife, Adrienne, will be in front of the marquee in his statue. And 2 to 4, James Armistead. You remember the African-American that Lafayette recruited to spy on Lord Cornwallis. And Lord Cornwallis, seeing how astute Armistead was, recruited Armistead to spy on Lafayette. Double agent. So come down to Lafayette Square. I've heard tell there will be some snow cones there, and you'll get a patch once having ridden the Lafayette Trolley that says, I rode the Lafayette Trolley. So Friday, June the 9th, Saturday, June the 10th. Come on down and be with us. Lafayette wanted a command. He wanted to command a division in the Continental Army. And in fact, he was tactful, but he went about lobbying Washington to get his command of a division. Lafayette, you understand, was a major general, but it was sort of an understanding that that commission was honorary. Well, but that's not the way Lafayette took it. Lafayette didn't want to be an ornament. He didn't want to be on the sidelines. He didn't want to be a spectator. He wanted to be in the game. He wanted to be in battle. Sometimes, it's difficult. There's something that you'd like to do, but overcoming the initiative, the solvent, just overcoming that to get engaged is difficult. Because sometimes you wonder whether or not you can succeed, and you worry about failing. Lafayette didn't have that mentality at all. He wanted to get in the battle. Lafayette was at the Moravian community of Bethlehem, you recall. He had been wounded in his left calf at the Battle of Brandywine. So he was in rehab. He had gotten a ride to Bethlehem from Henry Lawrence, who was a member of the Continental Congress from South Carolina. Lawrence had given Lafayette a carriage ride going from Bristol to Bethlehem, and the two of them had gotten to know one another. They'd become friends. This is really worth a moment. Lafayette made friends easily. He smiled. He listened. He talked. He was a good conversationalist. There was a book that came out just this year by Paula Cohen, and it was called Talking Cure: The Civilizing Influence of Conversation. And she has one conversation. She talks about conversation in it and what makes for good conversation, but she has one chapter where she argues that the best conversationalists in the world are the French. Well, Lafayette was the epitome of that. Apparently, he could converse well. He appeared comfortable conversing, and he appeared comfortable sharing personal issues with people, so he could become intimate with them. And Lafayette had none of that haughty arrogance that defined his fellow Frenchmen, and for which they were disliked. This came natural to him, this self-deprecating humor. It was natural to Lafayette, and people liked that about him. Lafayette made friends easily. That's a big deal. Your dad was right. Sometimes it's not what you know, it's who you know. Lafayette and Henry Lawrence were good friends. Lafayette wrote his last letter. You remember the inveterate letter writer. Wrote his last letter from Bethlehem on October the 18th, a Saturday. And he wrote to Henry Lawrence. Lafayette still hadn't had all the flesh to heal up yet. His leg was still swollen, couldn't get it in a boot. But he wrote this letter to Henry Lawrence. And it's instructive just to see the content of that letter. First, he complimented Lawrence's son, Major John Lawrence. John Lawrence was 23 years old, 3 years older than Lafayette, and he had been at the Battle of Germantown back in October, earlier that month in October. And the Continentals had been pinned down by British regulars who were stove up in a stone house, the Chew House, there at the Battle of Germantown. Well, John Lawrence decided to storm that stone edifice. So with his sword in one hand and a torch in the other, he stormed this place. He pushed open the wooden door and then torched the wooden frame on the inside. He was wounded in the right shoulder. 2 days later, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel on account of his bravery and appointed one of 4 aides-de-camp to Washington. Some people said that John Lawrence, that it wasn't bravery, that it was more recklessness. At least it was bravery with abandon. So Lafayette complimented Henry Lawrence's son. Then Lafayette stood up for the interests of his fellow Frenchmen. He argued that they ought get commissions because they were good men. Lafayette was always looking out for the interest of his fellow Frenchmen. Then he lamented the want of uniforms for his Continental comrades. And then he hinted to Lawrence that he would like to have a command. And in fact, Lafayette had suggested to Washington that there was a division available. Adam Stevens, you recall, had been cashiered out of the Army back in the Battle of Germantown. He was accused of being inebriated. And Lafayette suggested that he could take over that division. It's also interesting that about 5 days later, Henry Lawrence replied to Lafayette. And it was a very cordial letter. But it was in that letter that Henry Lawrence referred to, quote, your black servant. We have no details about what that means. Mike Duncan, in his book, Hero of Two Worlds, assumes that that is the black servant that Edmund Bryce purchased for 180 pounds back in Annapolis for Lafayette. But we don't have details. We don't know anything about that. That extrapolates. Washington liked Lafayette, liked him personally. That austere Washington really saddled up. Lafayette made friends with Washington, one of his closest friends. But Washington also admired Lafayette professionally. Lafayette had proven his valor at the Battle of Brandywine. But Washington was in a delicate position. Lafayette was now lobbying for this command of a division, and yet Washington had been given to understand by the Continental Congress that that commission of Lafayette's was honorary, that Lafayette was not to be put in harm's way. Well, Lafayette returned to Washington's headquarters at White Marsh, Pennsylvania, a day later, on October the 19th. Certain things happened that changed the Continental Congress's perspective on Lafayette and his getting a command. First, on November the 1st, Washington wrote Congress to clarify exactly what their stand was as far as Lafayette in a command was concerned. Washington argued that Lafayette deserved a command. Number one, he was enthusiastic about the American cause. Number two, Lafayette tried to deflect some of the animosity that some of the Frenchmen were now casting on the Continental Army. Those Frenchmen, many of them, did not get the commissions they'd anticipated. So they were disappointed, disenchanted. Now they were going to go back to France, and they were going to badmouth the Continental Army. Lafayette did his best to deflect that criticism. And then Lafayette wanted uniforms and wanted resources for his men, and he argued for that. So Washington told the Continental Congress that he thought Lafayette deserved a command. The second thing that happened that same day was seminal. It was November the 1st, 1777. Henry Laurens was named president of the Continental Congress. So now Lafayette's good friend was in a position of persuasion in the Continental Congress. And then Lafayette himself did things that helped persuade the perspective of Congress. Let's lay out the land. Here was the chessboard. On September the 26th, General William Howe captured Philadelphia. So now the British needed supplies. The best way to get those supplies was from the Chesapeake up the Delaware River to Philadelphia. Or else they had to go overland by way of Chester. That was tedious. There was a problem. The Delaware River south of Philadelphia was in Continental Army hands. The Continental Army had placed chevaux de frise at 3 different places along the Delaware River south of Philadelphia. A chevaux de frise, and this was Benjamin Franklin's idea, by the way, a chevaux de frise was a line of spikes that were buried in the water, and an oncoming ship would impale the hull on those spikes, sink. There were some safe passages, but only a select number of patriots knew exactly where those passages were. So 15 miles south of Philadelphia, at Marcus Hook, Pennsylvania, there was one line of chevaux de frise. Marcus Hook, old town. As a matter of fact, Blackbeard's mistress lived there, and the plank house where she lived still stands. Renovated, but still stands. By the way, Blackbeard's real name was Edward Teach. Not quite as intimidating or as posing as Blackbeard. Just north, over on the New Jersey side, was Fort Billingsport, north of Marcus Hook. Fort Billingsport was commissioned by Washington. It was engineered by Tadeusz Kosciuszko, the Polish engineer. And right there, across the Delaware River at that point, another chevaux de frise. 3 miles north of Fort Billingsport, still on the New Jersey side, was Fort Mercer. Fort Mercer was named after Hugh Mercer. Hugh Mercer died at the Battle of Princeton, but his great-great-great-grandsons were Johnny Mercer from Savannah, the songwriter, wrote Moon River.
Moon River, wider than a mile, I'm crossing you in style, someday.
Days of wine and roses.
The days of wine and roses, smile and run away.
Hooray for Hollywood.
Hooray for Hollywood, that phony super coney Hollywood.
And by marriage, great-great-great-grandson, General George S. Patton. 400 American soldiers were there at Fort Mercer, and they were commanded by Colonel Christopher Greene, who was a third cousin of General Nathaniel Greene. And right across the river, right where the Schuylkill River intersected the Delaware, on the south bank, there was Mud Island. It was also called Fort Battery Island. And there was a fort right there, another 400 Americans stationed right there. September the 26th, as soon as Howe took over Philadelphia, Howe started shelling Fort Mifflin, is how Fort Battery Island is usually known today. It was really named that in 1795 after Thomas Mifflin, the first governor of Pennsylvania. But Fort Mifflin was shelled. And in fact, Thomas Paine went to visit on October the 15th, and he said that day 30 shells fell on Fort Mifflin. They were being hammered. Fort Billingsport fell to the British on October the 2nd. After that, Colonel Carl Van Donop, who was a Hessian from Philadelphia, he declared that he would take Fort Mercer, that either he would stand or Fort Mercer would stand, one or the other. So on October the 22nd, Carl von Donop and 1,200 Continentals and Hessians attacked Fort Mercer, the Battle of Red Bank. At the end of that day, Fort Mercer was still standing. Carl von Donop was injured, died 3 days later. On November the 15th, it became clear the shelling on Fort Mifflin just took its toll. They could take no more. Private Joseph Plum Martin was there. He later wrote his memoirs. It's one of the primary source resources for boots on the ground observations of the American Revolutionary War. They had had enough, and so those 400 evacuated the night of November 15th to Fort Mercer across the Delaware River. The next day, the British took over Fort Mifflin. Colonel Howe then ordered Lord Cornwallis to cross the Delaware from Bristol to Fort Billingsport, and then to move on Fort Mercer to take it and capture it. So Cornwallis took 2,000 men, November the 17th, crossed and at Fort Billingsport, and then headed up toward Fort Mercer. Colonel Christopher Greene could see that writing on the wall. Lord Cornwallis was going to capture them all. So on November the 19th, Colonel Greene evacuated Fort Mercer. Lord Cornwallis took over the next day. Washington did not have all that information. So on November the 19th, Washington ordered General Nathaniel Greene to cross over from Pennsylvania to New Jersey and to stop Cornwallis. So Greene took 3,100 men and crossed over on November the 21st. Here's where Lafayette comes in. Lafayette volunteered to go with Nathaniel Greene, and General Greene was pleased to have him. Greene wrote his wife, a very talkative personality plus Catherine, Katie Greene, wrote his wife that Lafayette was a sweet-tempered gentleman, and he was pleased to have him. So Lafayette joined this troop on November the 24th at Haddonfield. And it was here that Lafayette was first given any kind of command of his own. It wasn't command of a division. It was about 300 men, their militia, Continentals, and Daniel Morgan's Pennsylvania riflemen were in the mix. Lafayette was responsible for scouting, for finding out where Cornwallis was and what he was doing. So on November the 25th, Lafayette decided he needed to get the lay of the land himself. So he and a scout, alone, went toward Lord Cornwallis's camp to scout it out. So they got up to Sandy Point, which was just north of Gloucestertown, which is where Lord Cornwallis was encamped. Lafayette could see the outposts. Lord Cornwallis out here. They could have picked him off. Apparently they didn't, because there were dragoons who were scouring that neck of the woods, and surely those pickets thought that the dragoons would capture Lafayette. And in fact, one squad of dragoons almost did. Lafayette and the guide, it was a near miss. Lafayette, he was bobbing and weaving. He was in his element. The guide was rattled. That afternoon, we're still on November the 25th, that afternoon, Lafayette returned to his platoon and then led them toward Gloucestertown. In that platoon, there were two of the three marquises who were in the colonies at the time. One was the Marquis de Lafayette, the other, the Marquis de la Rouet, who went by Colonel Armand, and he was second in command. The third was Colonel de la Malmedy, and he was out elsewhere. One of the other Frenchmen in Lafayette's platoon was Colonel Duplessis. That afternoon, Colonel Duplessis and his squad surprised a platoon of Hessians. There were 350 of them. They were about 2.5 miles down King's Road, right outside Gloucestertown. Lafayette was in command. It was his decision to make as to what transpired. Either he could retreat, or he could skirmish, or he could attack. There was no hesitation. There was no sputtering. Lafayette attacked. Really sort of shell-shocked the Hessians. Twice the Hessians had reinforcements to come up, and twice Lafayette beat them back, their 2 cannon notwithstanding. Finally, nightfall came, and Lafayette had to retire back to Haddonfield. But he had acquitted himself well. He had deployed flankers. He had deployed vanguards, the Pennsylvania riflemen out front. He had really done well. Nathaniel Greene the next day wrote Washington and told Washington how well things had gone at this Battle of Gloucester, where Lafayette had been in command for the first time. And then Greene ordered Lafayette to report to Washington to write an outline of the battle. Lafayette downplayed his role in it, another significant thing to note, but really lauded his men, lauded their valor, they were brave, and talked about those Pennsylvania riflemen. Lafayette said they ran in front of him all afternoon long. Lafayette was proud of his men. Another reason that the Continental Army loved Lafayette. So now, Washington was convinced Lafayette needed a command of his own, and that day, Washington wrote the Continental Congress, wrote the president of the Continental Congress to say Lafayette deserves a command of his own. The Continental Congress agreed, and on December the 1st, its president, Henry Lawrence, wrote Washington to say that Congress agreed Lafayette should be given a command of a division, and just a few days later, on December the 4th, Washington's general orders announced that Lafayette would take command of Adam Stevens' division. 3,086 men, 11 regiments, 3 brigades. So there would be Muhlenberg, Woodford, and Scott. About 2 weeks later, on December the 15th, Lafayette and a squad, they were out scouting on the Schuylkill River on the Pennsylvania side, and they were scouting out a ford, and across the river were some British regulars. And they started skirmishing, firing at one another. So this is the Battle of Gulf Mills. Nothing really came of it, but it was the third time in about as many months that Lafayette had been in battle. Lafayette at this time also took off those rose-tinted spectacles. Lafayette had come to America with an idealized vision in his mind's eye of what America was all about. He thought that all Americans were patriots, that they all supported Washington. But then he became aware of the Conway cabal. So this loose conspiracy to replace Washington as commander-in-chief. He became aware of the leanings of General Thomas Mifflin, who favored replacing Washington. He found out that General Horatio Gates, whom Lafayette had befriended, was the prime candidate to replace Washington. And he became aware that Brigadier General Thomas Conway was in favor of replacing Washington. The Continental Congress established a board of war. Thomas Mifflin was on that board. General Horatio Gates was named president. And Thomas Conway was named Inspector General of the Continental Army and promoted from Brigadier General to Major General. None of that went through the Commander-in-Chief. It now became clear to Lafayette that these so-called friends, Horatio Gates, Thomas Conway, that they had saddled up to Lafayette in order to ride his prestige to further their own interests. Lafayette was livid. He had been taken in. He had been gullible. He rushed over to Washington's tent to tell Washington that Washington was the man for this job and to apologize for being taken in. Well, Washington was backed up. He had meetings. Lafayette couldn't see him. So Lafayette, the inveterate letter writer, went back and on December 30th wrote Washington a letter, what Louis Gottschalk calls the valiant letter. Lafayette admitted that he'd been taken in, apologized, and declared his loyalty to Washington. Hands down, case closed, period at the end of the sentence. Lafayette did not sit down with an accounting pad to figure out whether or not his own interest would be best served by being on this contrary side. There was no even thought of that, and that's significant. That was Lafayette's mindset. Washington replied the next day, on the 31st. And it's instructive. This very austere man really said some very personal things to Lafayette. Washington, writing to Lafayette, said this: "It will ever constitute part of my happiness to know that I stand well in your opinion." I'm also impressed with some of Washington's phrases. Just listen to this. "I stand well in your opinion because I am satisfied that you can have no views to answer by throwing out false colors, and that you possess a mind too exalted to condescend to dirty acts and low intrigues." I wish I'd written that. Dirty acts and low intrigues to acquire a reputation. And then Washington turns and expresses a philosophy. "But we must not," Washington says, "in so great a contest, expect to meet with nothing but sunshine. I have no doubt but everything happens so for the best, that we shall triumph over all our misfortunes, and shall in the end be ultimately happy." This is Living Lafayette, to discover, to inform, to entertain. Till next time.